Well, good evening, everybody, and I'd like to thank you all very much for zooming in. I would much rather be there with you in person, and not just because I like to talk to people and see them face to face, but I was promised dinner, and so it seems very sad to me that I won't be getting that, but I'm going to hold you all to it, that come next year when we're out of lockdown, I can come along to your club and have supper. Now, I come from a family who relish a blank page. Father, brothers, cousins, grandparents, great-grandparents, on both sides were writers all. They've tackled plays, cookery, gardening, children's books, history, crime, and of course, journalism. Now, when it comes to filling a shelf, I have to say that I am a bit of a late starter. But I do have a lot of material to draw on, especially when it comes to Anne. My mother would have been highly amused to see that I'm talking to you all now. I barely scraped by with an O-level, and the idea that Oxford or Cambridge would have opened their doors to me was frankly laughable. I left school at 16, my headmistress having issued the damning statement that we're still waiting for the penny to drop. Well, I obviously never went to university, but my daughter, who you'll meet later on, and Anne, and my brother all left before they completed their degrees. Anne attended, as you know, Somerville College on a classical scholarship. And for 5 terms, she consumed Latin and Greek. And while she loved the work, she did find Oxford a very gloomy place. She describes the spires as rain-washed, and that miasmas rose up from the rivers. So all in all, she makes it sound more like a city from a sort of hammer house of horror than sort of any kind of idyll in the home counties. She was expecting brilliant conversation and a freedom that she certainly didn't get at home. But instead, at that time, she found the male undergraduates looked at women with huge amounts of suspicion. And Somerville locked their gates very early on, so that she had to climb over the wall on many occasions. She thought it was more like a boarding school than any kind of place of enlightenment. She left to the fury of her father in 1933, but not until she'd obtained a first in mods and been proposed to, I think this is quite important, 3 times during her 2-year sojourn, which I have to say, by any stretch of the imagination, I think is quite good going, and rather puts sort of pay to Anne thinking it was sort of such a gloomy place to go to. Anne certainly did not think that university was for the masses. She thought that some benefited and that others did not. And it shouldn't be automatic that everybody went on to higher education. It just wasn't, as far as she was concerned, common sense. She didn't see a university education as a direct route to job security. It wasn't a training college. Anne was a firm believer in study for study's sake. She would have been incandescent, were she alive, to hear about platforming and safe spaces. I can hear her voice in my ear just saying, well, what are they all there for, dear? She thought everyone should have a voice, and that voice, if necessary, should be challenged. I'm often asked why I refer to her in the books and in talks as Anne. And this obviously is to sort of slightly take a back step from the mother figure. This isn't a book about me. Anne was first and foremost a writer, and the mothering role by necessity and also by her own inclination took rather a back seat. And if I could ask Ruth now to bring up the cartoon that I think you got a quick flash of a moment ago. Ta-da! No, nearly. Yes, there it is. And it's Osbert's drawing of Anne, and she's talking to Maudie Littlehampton, and we've got George Weidenfeld, the publisher, loitering in the background, and also Bernard Levin. And I think I should say at this point that Anne was not the inspiration for Maudie Littlehampton. It may be that Osbert liked to look for women who looked like Maudie. He certainly did use her fashion. I mean, I recognise that dress from the cartoon very well. So And that's relevant really to why I started writing the book. We're going to go back to 2008, and Osbert had done a retrospective for the Wallace collection in London, and I'd gone round for a second look alongside the public, and there was a tour guide was leading round, well, a rather substantial group, and I tagged along at the back to listen. And he got to the 1960s, and he started to regale his audience with home life round at the Lancasters. So hang on, I thought, that's my bit. And I wanted to put my hand up and say I was there. But of course, it was his talk, so I didn't. But it did start me thinking that I had rather a unique angle on the family. Thank you, Ruth. I think we can probably leave that for a minute. There's me again. Then a couple of years ago, I started to receive emails from around the world, as far afield as Canada, of people wanting to know more about Anne. After all, she had devoted a lifetime to print, and it seemed very obvious. Why leave it to somebody else? Any good researcher could chart her writing career, but I had spent a lifetime studying my subject firsthand. I wanted to remind people who have read her work or may have only known her from her gardening books what a cracking good journalist she was. And I wanted to give an insight onto our home life and what she thought about everything from religion, Christmas, clothes, gardening. She was one of the first generation of female career journalists, and she was a woman absolutely in a man's world. My mother disliked clutter. When something came into the house, something else went out. Luckily, this did not apply to her writing. All her articles meticulously pasted into scrapbooks, and they're all dated. And after this surge of interest, I started to read the articles again. And it was by reading them that I realized they had to be seen again. So half of the book is Anne's articles, and half is my take on her personality. I hadn't opened her cutting books for a long time, and I began in the 1950s, which is when she first stepped onto the paving stones of Fleet Street. By this time, she already had Vogue and Picture Post on her CV, and at the very start of her career, a somewhat less renowned magazine called Weldon's that specialised in craft, and in fact gave a free pattern away, I think, with every issue. Mother was employed rather strangely as their agony aunt, but actually it was a career to which she was actually rather well suited, but it didn't suit her. So she answered all the letters, gave them back to the editor alongside her notice. And I'm going to ask Ruth now if she can bring up a rather glamorous photograph of Anne, photographed by Cecil Beaton. Yes, and there she is, looking terribly glamorous in furs. And it was when she first went to Vogue that this picture was taken. As a matter of fact, it doesn't remind me very much of Anne. It doesn't seem to have her personality in it, but it is a very, very beautiful picture. Thank you, Ruth, that's great. After she went to Vogue actually after she'd answered an advertisement as assistant to the knitting pattern editor. So her career took rather sort of interesting turns. And it was a very hands-on job. She didn't actually have just read the patterns. She had to re-knit readers' woolies. So if they sent them in with holes or mislined, Anne was responsible for unraveling the cardigans, putting them back together again and posting them back. When she applied for the job, she told me she could hardly cast on, but by the time she left, she was an expert knitter. And she only gave up when Osbert found the sight of her knitting needles in hand, sitting opposite him, too depressing to bear. So she gave up knitting. She stayed at Vogue for 7 years, working her way through the beauty department and the editorials. But she was always very dismissive of fashion magazines. She thought she should and she could do better. She stayed working on them too long. In 1945, after the war, she accepted the post as the first woman's editor for Harper's Bazaar. And she tried to up the ante with poems by Betjeman and Elizabeth David, cookery, but it never really suited her, and it was a post that she always regretted. And indeed, when I first started my career on the fashion pages of Harper's and Queen magazine, in the first moments that I were there, she said, whatever you do, don't stay too long. By which time, I mean, I think I'd hardly found out where Bond Street was, and I certainly hadn't been there a week. but she was very, very determined that fashion was not what it was all about. Now, my book is centred around the time when Anne started to work on Fleet Street. It's 1954, and it's reading these articles that just reminds me what a very modern writer Anne was. The articles are funny, they're pasty. She was of a school of thought that thinks, why use 200 words when 50 will do the job? She tackles subjects that were bang on trend today: mothering, money, plastic surgery. And I still think that with a few name changes, you could put her articles into the Times or the Telegraph and challenge their readers to spot the pieces, because they are very modern in the way that they're written. She'd been hired by the then editor Harold Keeble to write a piece on the death of Queen Mary. Now, this proved terribly popular, and on the back of that, she was asked to write other articles. And it wasn't long before Harold said, would she like to have her own page? And it was to be called the Anne Scott James page. And it was to have her byline on the top, which was something that simply had never been done before. And it was also to prove one of the happiest times of her career. Ruth, thank you. We have our next picture. This is Anne, and I love this picture. It's actually taken when she was at Picture Post. I think that people think Picture Post that the photographs were very much reportage, but they were much more likely to be staged and set up. And this picture is absolutely set up, although I do recognise the old Olivetti typewriter. I think it must have followed her from house to house. But it's certainly not her desk, as Anne was an absolute sort of control freak when it came to the pen, the paper and everything being terribly tidy. And as you can see, that one certainly is not. Thank you very much, Ruth. The Anne Scott James page had the brief to inform and to entertain the female reader. And I think I absolutely have to point out here that in 1954, the Express and the Sunday Express were papers of choice. And they boasted a heady circulation of over 4 million readers. And it's easy to forget that that's how everyone got their news, via the newspapers. Papers now number their readership in thousands, so millions is they could dream on that one, and have become a very serious player. And it was also an aspirational career. Journalists were cheered, welcomed even. Fleet Street was an area of excitement and romance. When you went to the office, you often met people to go and have lunch with or sandwiches with. All the papers were there. The Times, the Mail, the Telegraph, the Mirror, all had an office based on that street. The Jewish Chronicle was the last paper to leave in 2013. But I'm very glad to say that there's one periodical that is still waving the flag for journalism, and that's the Beano. The wine bar of choice for gossip was El Vino. Although as a woman, Anne would not have been allowed to order at the bar. Her drink would have to have been taken to her at the back of the wine bar. And it wasn't until the early 80s that this changed, and a couple of journalists took El Vino to court under equal rights. I think it was a hangover from the war, when apparently women of ill repute would gather trying to pick up men at the counter. But I have to say that Anne would much rather have been thought of as a woman of ill repute than missed out on a bit of gossip or a good story. I'm going to ask now for Ruth to put out the picture of this very iconic picture of Anne in a trouser suit. There she is, propping up the bar, looking very gorgeous. And Fleet Street pubs were very much defined along party lines. And actually looking at this photograph, which I have many times, I just noticed the other day that the turn-ups have been taken down and they obviously hadn't been ironed out. She did have very long legs. Thank you, Ruth. And I'm also going to say thank you to Jeremy Deeds, another man who has the ink of Fleet Street just running through his DNA, who said he recognised the pub rather mysteriously. He said he couldn't remember the actual name, but he remembered its nickname. And the pub in that photograph was used by journalists on the Daily Sketch, and it was called Auntie's. As a Daily Mail journalist, Jeremy wouldn't have been allowed in except on sufferance. He said the Daily Mail had their own pub up the road, which was nicknamed rather appropriately the Mucky Duck. The photograph, for those of you who are interested, is taken by the iconic photographer, Bert Hardy, who was great friends with Anne and who worked with her a lot on Picture Post and then later on the Express. And if I can ask Ruth to bring up a photograph of them together, should be another picture coming up. Thank you, Ruth. And this is a lovely picture taken when they were both in their late 80s. And you can just see the connection between the two of them. This is a couple who really get each other. Thank you. Anne's page was to set the bar for a new form of journalism. She could write on any subject that appealed to her. It could be a 10-liner on childbirth, an interview with a politician or a plastic surgeon, and all the topics were just squished together onto her weekly page. She appealed to her readers to challenge her if they disagreed with something that she'd read during the week, and that involved them with her column. Indeed, if she felt a subject deserved it, she would write a whole 1 week around a one-issue subject. And I think it was the variety and the unexpected nature of the page that made it a rollicking and indeed must-go-to read. You don't get that kind of cross-pollination today across topics, and I'm sure journalists would relish being able to do that. She'd also started to cross the male-female divide in terms of her readers, and that was very exciting for her too. Everything Anne tackled was written in the same very brisk, informative style. It didn't matter if it was politics or it was fashion. She assumed that her readers were intelligent and they were informed, so her pieces would never slip into the banal. Engagement was all. Obviously her column was absolutely driven by her personal views, but she was very well aware that it shouldn't be used to promote her personal problems or to stoke vanity. It was the reader, not the ego of the writer, that was central to her pieces, which again is completely different today, where every journalist has to lay forth their soul before they write a piece. And I think this is what made them so entertaining and created this connection. And when she interviewed celebrities, my goodness, they were celebrities. They were the A-listers of their time. It didn't matter if it was a politician, a business mogul, an actress, and they all wanted to be included. She'd reached a status where getting interviews was simply not an issue. She was taken to court once by a paediatrician who thought that she'd rather demeaned his skills and reputation. And she did appear at the Old Bailey in 1960 on behalf of the defence in the trial of Lady Chatterley. She was summoned as an expert witness on family matters, but the prosecution had decided that wasn't enough. She was definitely going to be a literary expert, and he started to challenge her credentials. All I can say is good luck with that one. She possessed a strong sense of irony, and it could be used to punishing effect in the home, but it worked like a charm in print. Leisure and work crossed over. Everything she did fed in some way or another back into her writing. And even when she was relaxing, it was with a small little lined notebook at her side. She wrote, "My working life consists of moving around and talking to people and writing. When I get on holiday, like a piece of wound up clockwork, I move around, I talk to people, and I write." Everything and everyone she encountered provided the oxygen for her page, and it was to words that she turned to when she needed to switch off. Reading was central to her life, and writing probably even more so. Through the self-expression of writing, she found a release from the sort of nervous core which was core to her personality. She had terrible writing, wasn't at all improved by speed writing during interviews. She never learned shorthand. And the small notebooks that she kept absolutely by her side were filled with jottings and thoughts for ideas for stories, shopping lists, and they were central to operations. They're quite entertaining reading in their own right. You might find little shopping lists which say 15 pints of cream, and then next door to it be shock treatment for infidelity. Is the corner shop cashing in? Well, how satisfying is France? You get the idea. She had a very good list of interviewees on one occasion before she went on a trip to France, which said Bardot, Jean Seberg, Belmondo, which I thought was a very cheery list. She was strong on common sense and very short on whinging. She was brought up, that generation, to be absolutely self-reliant. There was no time in her life for self-pity. She thought lives were messy, and hers often was. She had a mantra which she would often repeat to me: we weren't put on this earth to have fun, dear. And although it sounds rather brutal, it did actually resonate to me in a very, very positive way. And it also made me think, and thinking in our house was very important, as important in the home as it was on her page. And I'm now going to ask Ruth to bring up a picture of Anne and Osbert. And there they are, Anne and Osbert in her garden at Rose Cottage. Osbert was always called the spectator gardener, so that's exactly what he's doing now. And Anne looks as though she's doing something useful, pruning things. Anyway, she's doing something in the garden. Thank you, Ruth. She didn't start to write about gardening for some years after she left the Express, but it was like sawing her in half not to talk about her absolute passion for plants. This began as a child when she would help her mother doing the front garden at their house in Bayswater. It did take her marriage to Osbert Lancaster to kickstart her career. She needed that financial security, otherwise she had to work to earn money. And at the same time, it was apparent to her that Fleet Street was starting to wane. She said, sad working in a declining industry, especially when it's harikiri and not natural death. And so she started to look for a field that she didn't just like, but that was actually, she loved, she adored it. And it was 1968 when Hugh Johnson commissioned Anne to write a series of articles. She knew she wasn't a trained horticulturalist, that wasn't her area, so she decided to concentrate on the people behind their gardens. And again, she wrote, I literally didn't know which were the best catalogues or growers, but all the people you meet are heavenly. People who wouldn't want to talk on any other subject poured forth about their gardens. She wrote 9 gardening books in all and was made a member for the Council of the Royal Horticultural Society in 1978. And again, she was their first female member. She didn't count herself as a feminist. She often told me that she wasn't one. And she was not interested in furthering the cause. I think she thought it was hard enough to forge her own path. She certainly expected to be treated as an equal, but she loathed the idea of tokenism. She died when she was 96, and she was still firing on all cylinders up to the very end. I went to visit her in hospital where she was waiting to have an operation. Just to set the scene slightly, the view from her window was filled with scaffolding, and the MPs at Westminster were having their expenses sheets combed over. And I wrote down this final conversation because, like her writing, it's short and it's sharp and it's to the point. She wrote 2 lists in her notebook, which she gave me, one for if she survived the operation and one for if she didn't. So you can see Anne has a very practical side to her nature. So I'm going to end this part of the talk by reading you an extract before my daughter, Anne's granddaughter, Calypso, joins me for a short conversation. And there's a picture of Anne taken again when she's in her 80s. Thank you, Ruth. Nipping up there, not quite. Yes, ta-da! There she is, the last bit. Thank you, Ruth, that's great. Don't take the notebook. It has addresses I need in the back. Tear it out. Oh, I love it here. I've had the most intelligent chat I've had in weeks with the doctor about the hereafter. Well, I'd just like to move in here, but the view's not lovely, is it? And it won't get any better when they take that lot down. You remind me of that Chekhov line, the cherry orchard, or was it the 3 sisters? You're all in black. Are you in mourning for your life? The papers. Oh, well, I just had to have them. I got the last from the trolley. Those dreadful MPs. I was once asked to sign a residence parking permit for a friend who lived out of town, came to London a couple of times a month and wanted one. Well, I refused. Other friends said they would have done it. but I just couldn't lie on a form. Would you have done it? She never liked me much afterwards. I'm not a bit worried. It's like it's all happening to someone else. Any news? Well, you better go now, dear. No point in coming in over the next couple of days. They tell me I shall be in some pain, but they will be monitoring it, so I shan't be worth seeing. Oh, but do keep in touch. Thank you. Thank you, Ruth. That's me. That's my bit over before Calypso.
Thank you very much. I think that had you a live audience, there would have been plenty of laughter and and reaction. So you did extremely well talking to a screen. And now we'd like to welcome Calypso for the conversation part of the event. So Calypso, if you're there, if you could. Yes. Brilliant. So I'm going to hand back over.
Where are you, Calypso? I've lost you.
I'm definitely there if you put me on speaker view.
Oh, is your video switched?
Oh, wait.
Yeah, perfect. Perfect.
Yeah, you'll see me. Hello. I really enjoyed your talk, Mum. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Calypso.
With Granny on her deathbed, you could have warned me of that one.
Sorry about that. Tears in the eyes. That's what we like to hear from the audience.
I still haven't decided whether I should call her Granny or Anne. So
you can switch between the two like I do. You're allowed.
Okay. Even though I'm nearly 40.
Even though you're nearly 40. All right. Okay. Whatever.
I was gonna. When would Granny have considered the pinnacle of her career?
Pinnacle of her career. Well, I suppose it would have been in the 60s when she was working for the Mail, because she had a huge readership then, and she was also at the same time she was appearing on the radio show My Word, which was broadcast across the world. So from the point of view of recognition, that is when people would have known who Anne Scott James was, very much so. What she would have considered her main passion would have been when she was doing the gardening. I mean, that was, from her point of view, her personal point of view, that would have been the pinnacle of her career. But from a recognition, financial, everything other point of view, it was the 60s.
I was reading all her articles. It's amazing how they could just be written now. I think even talking about fashion and you wouldn't be able to tell. I was thinking she'd probably be quite good at social media, but what do you think would be her best? Her best platform?
Well, she'd have been a rollicking good tweeter, because she would be very good at the short, sharp sentence. So certainly in terms of, she'd have been an excellent tweeter. She'd have definitely been cancelled, probably in about the first week, because she would not have been able to stop being honest about what she thought about things. So, I mean, Anne would definitely have been cancelled. She'd have been hopeless at Facebook. She would have loathed Facebook, and she would have loathed the fact that it was selfies and so all about me, which actually Anne was not at all. So she would have found that highly depressing. But she would have joined in with the tweeting until, as I say, she was, crossed off the list.
No pouting into Instagram then.
Certainly no pouting into Instagram. She would have hated that.
What else was I going to? Oh, and I also read in your book that there was an awful lot of staff. So
yes, we did have a lot of staff, and actually I have been asked that before, was whether Anne would have been the journalist that she became if she'd had to, do it without anybody. But we did have, I mean, labour must have been very cheap, because actually Anne wasn't rich apart from what she earned, and we did have a lot of people looking after us. So Anne was able to concentrate absolutely entirely on her work, which is a luxury that I should think today's would absolutely relish. But there were 3 people looking after us and my brother in London, and another 3 in the country. I mean, seamlessly. Staff just sort of came and went, and left Anne just to get on with it. I mean, I very rarely saw Anne when I was, up to when I was a teenager, because she was always out at the paper working.
When did she get her cottage in Berkshire?
She got the cottage actually while she was at Oxford. She went past it and there was a sign up on the house just saying for sale, and she borrowed the money from her mother, and it stayed with her all her life and was a source of solace to her at all times. But that's how she got it, borrowing the cash.
Did she have any other hobbies? Because you know, she did all her gardening and
yeah, she had loads of hobbies. In fact, when I think about it, she was passionate about tennis when she was young, strangely enough, and every year Wimbledon would dominate. Everything would stop to watch. Loved tennis. She was also rather keen on speaking French, and in fact, after Oswald died, she joined the Institut Français. So you could go and have French conversation and go and watch French films. Loved cinema, but of course reading. I mean, reading was, whether you call reading a hobby, I don't think Granny would have called it a hobby exactly, but that's when she was at her happiest, when she had a pile of books by her side. But she had a lot of patchwork was a hobby. I mean, she did actually have quite a lot of things to pass the time.
No, it does make you think, if you cut all the computers and cut all that screen time out of your life, how much else do you get done?
You could make a nice patchwork quilt and speak French. So yeah.
And I was also wondering, wait a second, I've forgotten my questions now. Oh, you said about her reading, and I wanted to know what were her favourite books on her reading list. Did she always have the
blimey.
Same book?
Well, I mean, honestly, it could be anything. Could have been anything from, well, eclectic, I suppose you could say. Well, I mean, it could have been anything. She might read the Quran one day because she wanted to find out more about it, or you know, she might then move on to reading sort of Lark Rise to Candleford. I mean, she loved the classics. She liked reading, as I said, she was very keen on French, so she liked to read Balzac in the vernacular. I mean, Trollope was a favourite. And actually, weirdly, Agatha Christie, you could often find Anne just whizzing through a little Agatha Christie. She was very fun. Didn't mind how many times she reread it. She liked crime novels. And also, but I don't know if she was terribly fond of The Tailor of Gloucester too, the Beatrix Potter book. I think that she thought it was nearly a perfect little read.
What did she think? What do you think she would have thought of your books?
Oh, what would she have thought of my books? I don't know, Cliff. So that's a really difficult question. She would, on one level, have been quite pleased. She was very interested in most things that I got up to, but she wasn't particularly good at encouraging me, I think, in any particular area. As I think I mentioned earlier, we have quite a lot of very competitive writers in my family, so sometimes it's better to take a back seat. I think she would have enjoyed them up to a point.
I think she would have loved The House in Little Chelsea.
She would have liked the house. Osbert would have loved The House in Little Chelsea. Does anyone else have any questions? I mean, anyone who'd like to join in or to ask her anything? Have you had any in, Ruth? Any questions there?
Yes, I already have a couple of questions. So the first question is from Eleanor Sturdy, and she asks, did Anne refer much to Oxford or Somerville over the years?
I'm horrified to say that she didn't particularly. As I say, she hadn't really enjoyed her time there. I think she was expecting so much more out of it. And so it was, to an extent, slightly disappointing. And I think it was more that it had disappointed her. And so she didn't particularly refer to it. She just she was driven to work. She wanted to be out there and she wanted to be writing. And so I'm sorry, but no, not particularly.
Oh dear.
I'm guilty now. I should have lied. Should I have lied?
Well, I think plenty of us did, which is why we're all staying in this community. But
Yes, absolutely. Of course, it was, you know, she was the first generation of women who went to Oxford. And I don't think they'd quite realised what they were supposed to do with women then. They sort of herded them into their college and kind of left them there. And she did say the men were very dismissive. They didn't really appreciate the women at all much. I think that they were, as she said, she kept saying they were suspicious of women. You know, why they wanted to be blue stockings, you know, they didn't sort of understand it.
Very different from the time when I went, thankfully.
Yes, absolutely.
And now, well, I will invite people to write further questions in chat if they'd like. I already do have another question from Eleanor Sturdy.
Well done, Eleanor. Well done, Eleanor.
Yes, very busy with questions. It's great. Her next question, she says, I'm enjoying my copy of the book. The paper is wonderfully glossy. Was that intentional? Magazine quality paper?
Oh, well, my publisher who's listening in tonight will be thrilled that the paper's been noticed. And I suppose, yes, but in a way, yes, because it just gives a kind of sumptuous to it. I mean, there was discussion at one time about, you know, whether we'd make the whole thing rather, you know, newsprinty, make it more like a newspaper. But then we thought, no, we'll give it a little slick of glamour instead and up the ante. And I think it does make it more interesting. It makes it look very nice.
It is beautifully.
So thank you, everybody at Pimpernel.
It's beautifully produced. Now, I don't yet have any further questions from the floor, but I wanted to ask you one for myself, which is, do you have any favourite pieces of advice that Clare wrote? Sorry, not Clare, you're Clare, that Anne wrote. And equally, are there any pieces of advice that she wrote that you completely object to? Or
you mean in her articles or what she would say to me?
In her articles. In her column?
In her articles, no, I don't think. I mean, there are obviously articles that I like a lot. I just love the way that all the articles are written. It's to do with the punctuation. It's to do with the graphics. It's to do with everything about them. And her voice sings off the page. I mean, you've only got to read any of them. And actually, I did think about including a couple of pieces, but actually they're quite long and they don't really benefit. They're not, you have to see them on the page to actually get the joy. And the headlines, all these brilliant headlines, I mean, they just are very good. You know, I've never been kissed on the toes. I mean, that's a very good headline. It draws you in. You want to know what she's going to write next. And pieces of advice. No, she was always very keen on, which did go through actually in her articles and actually in our lives, she was very keen on giving advice on if you got too fat. She absolutely would say she was a fat shamer, really. And she'd just sort of take one look at me and say, I think you put on a bit of weight, dear. So I think in that sense, and she writes about quite a lot of things in her articles about weight. And I think there's one line that says, a fat girl just has to learn to eat less. So, I mean, she's straight to the point.
Yeah, I've read some of the columns. I found particularly entertaining her comments on the worst dressed women.
Oh yes, the worst dressed women is very good too. Yeah. But again, you know, that could go into any articles today. But obviously, you probably have to change the names because people wouldn't know who these women were. But she's very to the point. You know, she wrote about fashion, but she wrote about it in a very kind of, you know, very ironic, very kind of pithy way.
She certainly did. Now I have another question here, this time from Caroline Totterdale. She says, it would be interesting to know if Anne ever mentioned Audrey Withers, her fellow Somervillian, who edited Vogue in the 1940s.
Again, no, she didn't. I think that Anne, to understand Anne never really went back on things. It was very difficult, and this may again be a generational thing, that she didn't ever particularly want to discuss her life or career. You had to force it out of her or to observe it, you know, as she was talking. So had I said to her, what did you think of Audrey Withers? But at that point, she probably wouldn't have come into my, you know, my auspices. Then she would have answered, but she never ever, she was always what she was going to do today, tomorrow. Never, she wasn't interested in looking back. You really had to prize information out of her, which actually I think is rather healthy. I think it's rather boring when people just spend their whole time opining about past joys. I think it's rather nice when they're thinking about what they're going to do the next day and next week, and I think it's rather good, rather positive.
I see, yes. So now I now have a question from Andrew Oss, if I pronounce it correctly. And he says, did her time at Oxford, in particular Somerville, give her freedom to think and let her imagination fly, which then later helped her to write?
The terrible truth is I don't really know the answer to that. I think she did. I have to go back to what she always said, that she found Oxford very constricting. She did meet good friends at Oxford, and in fact her first forays abroad came from people that she'd met while she was at Oxford. They took a little car and went into Europe, which was an absolute revelation for somebody who'd actually been brought up in London and the home counties, to actually experience abroad and travel. And she loved to travel. So in that sense, she met good friends there at university. And so from the travel point of view, yes. And she loved the work. I mean, she's always saying to me, I loved the work. What she didn't like was this confinement that they seemed to, that she seemed to feel when she was at Oxford.
Thank you for that, Claire. And I have now another question from S. Rose. I can't see a first name, but the question is, please could I ask Claire whether Anne enjoyed receiving feedback on her writing articles, or was her focus on the joy or need to express her thoughts?
No, she did like receiving, she did like getting feedback, and she positively encouraged it. She would write things that were kind of quite challenging in her articles, and she wanted, you know, everyone in those days, obviously, they're writing letters. So she's getting quite a sort of little, a feisty box that comes back to her. And yes, she loved it, because by readers writing back to her, she knew that she was engaging them, that they were engaging with her column. And so, yes, that was a very, very important to her. Absolutely.
Super. And well, another question's come in from Moira Black, and I'm going to ask a supplementary question of my own. She asks, how did Anne meet Osbert Lancaster? And then I would like to ask, you mentioned in the book that she wrote to him after his death. And I assume that you have these letters, and it must have been very...
Yes, well, it's, yes, she met Osbert on the Mail. They'd actually met before they actually got together as a couple, and I don't think that she particularly liked Osbert when she first met him, thought he was rather supercilious, but they eventually linked up, I believe, at a cocktail party in the good old-fashioned way, and he said it was a boring party, let's go and have dinner. And from there on, you know, they were together, and they did realise at that point that they did become a love match, really. I mean, she said he was her soulmate. And yes, I mean, she did, after Osbert died, she did write letters to him every day for a year, just not sentimental letters, they're just giving, telling him what was happening. She wanted to keep in touch with him. So it's just everything, you know, what happened today, what some politician might have done, what film she'd gone to see, what was coming out in the garden. I mean, just letters on bereavement. And she did say that after a year of, you know, of writing these letters, it was sort of honestly like she then realized that she no longer had to, you know, keep on writing to him, and that was sort of that was the end of that. So she, but every day for a year, it was just keeping in touch. She liked to keep in touch, a bit like her last conversation with me, keep in touch. That's what she wanted to do, and she was keeping in touch with Osbert.
Well, thank you for that. And I also have another question from Eleanor. Thank you, Eleanor.
Yeah, Eleanor's doing so well. Go on, Eleanor.
She's a question generator.
Yes.
And her question is, did Anne have a favourite garden? I assume she means a public or a garden that you could visit, such as a National Trust or similar.
Oh, well, that's an interesting question. And actually, I don't know. She would have obviously found lots of gardens individually, just very interesting. She just loved gardens. I mean, you know, obviously she would have loved, you know, she loved Sissinghurst. She wrote a book about Sissinghurst. And she liked the idea of people creating gardens. But I don't think she ever particularly said, this is the garden, you know, this is my garden for me. She just loved She just loved gardens. You would often see Mother just looking at plants. You know, she knew every plant, where she got it from in the garden, and she would just look at it. She was very intense in her kind of appreciation of gardens and just of a plant. You know, she just loved nature.
Yeah. It shines through in her books, I have to say. The affection is there. Thank you.
No, the affection is there, not at all. I mean, she knew, you know, she knew every place where every wildflower was growing in the area. When she was a small child, she would go around with a tin with her brother around Berkshire, and she would collect wildflowers and then press them in the evenings. That was her hobby and her passion. And this had begun as a tiny child. I think she said there was a barrow would arrive in the street outside their house in Bayswater, and they would choose the plants together, and then she would plant them with her mother. And this was, you know, this is where her her feelings for gardening came forth. But I mean, you really would see her. She would just be looking at a long time, just looking at a plant and thinking about it and studying it.
Oh, thank you for that. Now, could I ask another question? I think you did touch on why Anne said that she wasn't a feminist.
Yes.
But I think it would be interesting to elaborate more on that.
Well, she didn't, I suppose when she said she wasn't a feminist, she didn't think of herself as a sort of a card-carrying, tub-thunking feminist. She just believed that everybody was equal. And I think that she didn't feel that she had to kind of really overstate the case. And in some ways, I mean, that's how I was brought up. It was pretty much a revelation to me that some men might think that women were a sort of subspecies. I mean, I really did think, because of the way I was brought up, that we were equal, that I could do what I wanted to do, and I could go in any direction I wanted to go in. And that is what was core to Anne. I mean, that was core to her belief. And but I mean, she never no more have attended a march or decided that she was going to push forward the cause of women. And at that time, you know, everybody she was surrounded by, they were all men. And I think that she, it's very, you know, Fleet Street, she would be the only woman in the Daily Mail office. So she was, you know, had a lot to forge her own path was, you know, what she had to do, and not really think about whether she was going to drag the secretary in the next door room up with her. You know, that was her problem. And so she was quite selfish in that way, but you have to be selfish in order to maintain that kind of level, I think, in so many different fields.
I did notice in the book mentioned that she wasn't allowed, or only on one occasion, to go and see the print set. Did you call it?
Yeah, she wasn't allowed. They thought it was bad luck for a woman to go onto the stone, which is where the type was laid out for the newspapers. And so she would have to wait in the pub, and the subs would go down, bring her copy off the stone, so she could edit it. But every male journalist was allowed onto the stone. And so Anne was being paid, really, she was a star reporter, so she was getting more than anybody else on the paper, but she was not allowed on the stone. And I think eventually she made a sort of point of it and was allowed down, and the head of the print union apparently shook her hand, and there was a sort of, you know, there was a moment passed between them. But she said it was definitely sort of a token gesture. She never went back on the stone after that. It was the same thing carried on. But she said, oh, I made my point, we made our peace, and that was, you know, that was fine too.
I think I'll make this the last question, also from Eleanor. Thank you, Eleanor. Or the last call for a question. If anyone else has a burning question, please could they ask it right now? But I will now put to you Eleanor's question, which is, it would be great to hear your views on the future of papers and magazines, either digital or otherwise.
Well, I'm afraid, I think pretty dismal is the answer. I think that newspapers, especially now, I mean, they're being punished. There's no advertising going into anything anymore. And I don't think, I'd like to think there was a huge future for print, but I'm not sure that there is. I mean, it's battling on. So, you know, we're still there. You know, there are still newspapers obviously being bought and sold. But I think people now seem to want their journalism in such short, bite-sized amounts. They don't really want to, maybe on a Sunday, but they don't want to be scrolling through newspapers so much anymore, and especially, you know, it's a generational thing. You know, the younger you get, the less likely you are. I mean, my mother had every single newspaper was sent into the house. I mean, practically, you know, the cleaner would be staggering under the weight as she brought them into the house, you know. And my papers were bought in too. I would have Jackie, you know, that was added into the list, you know. But now, I mean, who buys all these papers? Nobody buys every paper now to check on the different opinions that are going on, or it's very, it is dying. I mean, I think the Evening Standard will certainly be the next London paper to go. It's just a question of how many weeks it manages to, months, you know, it holds on for, and then more and more papers will go online. But, you know, sadly, way of the world, really.
It is interesting to reflect on how Anne might have handled matters in this day and age. But perhaps,
well, she thought, you know, as I said, she thought the papers, you know, she thought they were dying a death anyway. She thought that journalists have become lazy, is what she actually said. She said they weren't investigating enough. They weren't, no one was looking after the young people to see how they were doing, to see how their copy was working out. She did really feel that newspapers have brought it on themselves to a large extent. And that's why she was very pleased to be able to leave Fleet Street and go and start doing gardening books. And yes, so she definitely thought that, you know, that they were doing, papers were doing themselves in to a large extent.